All right, so get ready, everyone. You've sent us a ton of climate change articles and reports, and we are diving in deep
Yeah, we're talking everything from like climate science basics,
to arguments that humans aren't even involved.
which is
Wild.
it's going to be a fascinating deep dive, a very hot topic, and not just because of the subject matter.
Right.
You're right; it's a really complicated topic with very passionate people on every side. So, our mission today is to try to help you navigate this, break down the core scientific arguments, maybe explore some nuances, and hopefully uncover some thought-provoking insights along the way.
Sounds like a plan. And I have to say, one source we got, Climate Science and Climate Justice 350, had me hooked at the title.
Yeah.
And then they just lay out their whole argument in 5 bold statements. It's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, and we can fix it.
Wow.
Talk about a way to start a conversation.
That'll certainly grab your attention. And I think as simplified as those statements are, they do touch on the core of what we're dealing with. Right?
Yeah.
The planet is warming. Human activity is the primary driver. The scientific community overwhelmingly agrees. Those 3 points are really backed up by a growing body of research.
Okay, so then where's the debate? Because I'm looking at all these sources and I
Yeah.
see some different points of view here.
Yeah, the disagreements really start when you get into the nitty-gritty of what those climate change impacts will be, how severe will they be, and then, of course, the feasibility and cost of all these potential solutions.
So it's not even just, is it happening? It's like, what does it mean? And what do we do about it?
Exactly, yeah. It's about understanding the different perspectives, interpreting all of this data, and then grappling with some really complex choices ahead. Like, for example, you've got NASA, you've got 350.org, both really highlighting that overwhelming scientific consensus on human-caused global warming.
Right, and they have some pretty compelling evidence, I gotta say.
They do.
But then we also have the NEN, the Fraser Institute.
Right.
And they're saying, hey, maybe it's not as black and white as everyone's saying it is.
Exactly. And they highlight something really important, and that's how W scientific consensus is measured and portrayed. Because, like, at the basis level, there is no doubt.
Right.
Right? Human-caused warming is real, but those numbers can really change based on how questions are worded, who's being asked, and then how those results are interpreted.
It's a good reminder that even in the scientific community, there's going to be, like, different
Of course,
perspectives.
different interpretations for sure.
You got to be mindful of that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of different perspectives, we have to talk about Piers Corbyn because, boy, does he have a different stance on this.
He really does.
Arguing that solar activity, not greenhouse gases,
Yeah.
is the main driver of climate change.
I got to be honest, that one threw me for a loop. He even says that the whole CO2 blanket concept is flawed physics. Like, that's not how heat transfer works.
Yeah, he's basically saying that, while the greenhouse effect is a real thing,
Right.
it's not the dominant factor in global warming. And he's pointing to historical climate data. He's saying that there's no hot spot over the equator, which some climate models predicted we would be seeing right now with rising CO2 levels.
Right.
And even questions the accuracy of the temperature measurements themselves.
That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
It's definitely a different way of looking at it.
It is. It's important to remember that his views, while very interesting, are outside that mainstream scientific consensus. He's bringing up interesting points, but it's not widely accepted in the community.
So how do we, like, as someone who's just trying to figure this out,
Yeah.
how do you even start to make sense of such different opinions?
Right. Well, that's where critical thinking comes in, right? It's not about just blindly accepting one side or the other. It's about looking at the evidence, understanding the methodology, understanding that there's potential for bias in any interpretation of data, particularly when it's this complex.
And all of these sources are kind of encouraging us to do that in their own way, right?
I think so.
Like, think critically, question assumptions, explore.
Yes, exactly. Dig deeper. And speaking of digging deeper, let's get into the impacts of climate change.
Okay.
This is where it gets really interesting
Yeah.
and where it gets heated.
Oh, yeah. 350.org, they don't hold back.
No.
They paint a very, like, dire picture.
Yes.
Extreme heat, sea levels rising, huge storms, ocean acidification, everything's under threat. Human health, food, entire ecosystems. They even have this one graphic showing millions being displaced.
Yeah, it's a very sobering picture they paint.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt that there's research to support those concerns. But the Breakthrough Institute article you've included brings up a really important point, which is the potential for bias in
Yeah.
this kind of impact research.
Okay.
They say there's a tendency to really focus on the most dramatic, negative potential consequences,
Right.
which, when you do that, can sometimes skew the overall picture.
And this is where I thought it was interesting. They give these examples of
Okay.
studies that have come out that are like, climate change is going to cause, and this is where it gets a little out there, reduced sleep,
Okay.
bumpier flights because of increased turbulence,
Okay.
and oh, by the way, it's going to make wine taste different.
Really?
So get ready to sip on some sour grapes in the future.
Wow.
But that's their point, right?
It is. It's not to say that that's not true,
Right.
but are those studies really indicative of a huge systemic crisis, or are they just sort of like, oh, that's interesting details?
So are they saying, like, don't worry about it?
No, not necessarily. It's about getting a more balanced and nuanced understanding of the risks, that if we just focus on the worst case scenario, we might miss some of the more manageable things, or even worse, undermine support for effective solutions.
Right. So it's like anything else. If you just hear doom and gloom all the time, you just tune it out.
Exactly. You just shut down. So it's about finding that balance, right? Raising awareness without being hyperbolic.
So how do you do that? How do you separate what's really a concern from what's just a really good headline?
Right.
And then how do I, as just a person, make good decisions with all this different information?
Well, those are great questions. And those are questions that luckily we'll be exploring in more depth as we continue this deep dive.
It's almost like we're putting together this huge jigsaw puzzle,
Right.
but all the pieces are from different puzzles.
Yeah. And some of them are changing shape as we're trying to put them in.
It's like, how can you make any decisions with so much conflicting information? How can you know the best way forward?
That is the question, isn't it? And there isn't an easy answer. But I think one really important thing to remember is that climate change isn't just a science issue.
Right.
Social, it's economic, it's political.
Totally.
So naturally, you're going to have all these different values, different priorities.
Different ways of looking at the world.
Exactly. And that leads right into that other point from 350.org, that it's bad, which, like we were saying, what's bad for one person isn't always bad for everyone.
Exactly.
An impact that might be devastating for one community might be totally fine or even helpful for another community. And the timescales we're talking about make it really difficult to understand the real costs and benefits of what we're doing.
Yeah, it's so long term.
Right. Like a tiny change in the average global temperature.
Right. It sounds small when you put it like that.
But it can have these huge ripple effects on ecosystems, on weather, on entire societies, and not just for a few years, but for decades, centuries.
So how do we even wrap our heads around that, especially when we're talking about these global issues that need everyone to work together?
It can feel impossible. You want to just give up or get lost in the arguments.
Right. It's overwhelming.
It is. But I think that's exactly when we need to remember that we're all human.
Right.
We've faced challenges that seemed impossible before, but we found ways.
We always figure it out.
We do. So let's talk about that final point from 350.org. The hopeful one, we can fix it.
Okay. Yeah. The fix it part.
Yeah.
It gives you hope, but also.
Also.
Is that realistic?
Exactly. And I think we're seeing both sides of it, right? We've seen this explosion in renewable energy.
Right. Solar, wind.
And energy efficiency, sustainable agriculture, carbon capture, and storage.
It seems like we have the tools.
It feels like we're getting there.
Or at least close.
Yes. And there are so many people, communities, even entire countries doing things to reduce their impact.
Yeah, you see it everywhere.
There's this momentum building, which is amazing.
It is hopeful, but like we've been talking about, there are still those challenges.
Of course.
Like the Breakthrough Institute article.
Right, what were they saying?
They were saying we need to be more realistic about how we do this whole climate action thing.
Yeah.
Because there are costs involved.
And trade-offs, yeah.
Right. They were saying that a rapid energy transition might actually hurt some people.
And they're not wrong, are they? Many of the poorest people in the world rely on fossil fuels.
It's cheap. It's available.
Right. So if we just cut that off without having something affordable and reliable to replace it with.
It's going to hurt the people who can least afford it.
Exactly. So it's not as simple as just switching to renewable energy. It has to be a just transition.
For everyone.
For everyone. And that means understanding energy, but also the economy and social justice and the environment. It's all connected.
Wow. So we need to completely rethink how we do this whole climate thing.
We do. It's not just about emissions. It's about how we live, what we consume, how our economy works, our whole relationship with the planet.
It's huge.
It is. But it's also exciting, right? We get to reimagine what's possible.
I like that.
We challenge the status quo. We create a future that works for everyone.
That's a powerful image.
It is. And we need everyone to be a part of it. Scientists, politicians, business leaders, communities, artists,
Even just regular people.
especially regular people. Everyone has a role to play in this.
Okay, I gotta admit, my head's spinning a little bit.
It's a lot. It's the science, the ethics, the politics, the real impacts on people.
It really makes you think.
It does.
Yeah.
It can feel overwhelming, for
Mhm.
sure. But that's why we do these deep dives.
To try to make sense of it all.
Yes. The more we learn, the more we talk about it, the better decisions we can make.
So it's not just about understanding climate change, it's about understanding what it means to be a person now,
Yes.
in this time. What can we do? What do we want the future to look like? What are we leaving for our kids?
Big questions.
They are. And I don't know if there are any easy answers,
Me neither.
but just asking them feels hopeful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It means we want to do better, and that's how we create a better future.
You know, through all of this, it's like, how do we balance it all? The urgency, but also being realistic, being hopeful, but also like
Right.
grounded in what's actually happening. And I keep coming back to the people, you know, like we can't forget about the actual humans living through all of this.
It's true. And that's something 350.org really emphasizes with their whole climate justice focus.
Yeah.
The idea that not everyone is impacted equally.
Right. Like it's not fair. Right.
No. The people who have contributed the least to the problem are often the ones who suffer the most.
Exactly. Like we were talking about those communities dealing with rising sea levels, the crazy droughts and food shortages.
Right.
Because the weather is just unpredictable. It's already happening to people.
It is. It's real. And it's not even just those immediate impacts. Climate change just makes everything worse.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh, yeah.
it's like a threat multiplier. So if you already have inequality and tension, climate change just pours gasoline on it.
Hmm.
Resources become scarce. People get displaced from their homes. They lose their livelihoods. It can lead to unrest, conflict,
Oh.
even mass migration.
It's a scary thought. And it's like those 5 simple points from 350.org. It's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, and we can fix it. It's both. Like, we got to do something now, but also,
Right.
how? How do we even begin to tackle all this?
Right. Yeah, I get it. It can feel really overwhelming. But I think we have to remember that within all of this complexity, there's actually this amazing opportunity. Like, we're not just talking about using less fossil fuels. We're talking about completely changing how we view the planet, how we treat each other, the whole system.
Yeah, we need a whole new perspective, don't we?
We do. Not just how do we fix this problem, but this is a chance to make things better,
Yeah.
to make things more fair, more sustainable.
For everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where, you know, I think those other sources you brought up are interesting. The NAS Fraser Institute,
Yeah.
even Piers Corbin with his kind of out there ideas, they challenge us to really think, you know, don't just take things at face value, question everything.
Consider different views.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even if you don't agree with them.
You know what? I'm realizing that there might not be one right answer.
Right.
It's less about finding the solution and more about navigating this really messy, complicated issue, making the best choices with what we know, and being open to new information and ideas.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. It's nuanced, there's uncertainty, and it's a journey we're all in together.
And like any good trip, it's not just about getting to the destination, right? It's about what you talk about along the way, the people you meet, what you learn,
Well said. And this is definitely a conversation that's going to continue.
for sure. But for now, we'll leave our listeners with this.
After this deep dive, what really stuck with you? What new insights did you get? And what questions are you still thinking about? Keep asking those questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.